Fed get the money to buy the Treasury
Yeah,
securities?
the Fed is doing an open market purchase,
Mhm.
and they pay $100 billion, say, for bonds that are held by other people. Okay, so where does the Fed get the money to buy the bonds?
Through like other banks? I mean, because people.
No, that's actually not the right answer. That's a reasonable answer, but that's not what they do. This is kind of a trick question. Does anybody want to try to answer the trick question part of it? Or I can just reveal. What they do is they create the money out of thin air. It didn't previously exist. They're the Fed. They control the financial system. They can just say, hey, let there be money. Okay, another way to think about it is the Fed keeps the books in the banking system, so they can just add $100 billion to their account and then write a check on it. So the money literally comes from nowhere. Okay, it's crazy, but that's the way it is. Okay, now to understand all this stuff, you need to remember that the Fed is outside of the banking system. It's outside of the financial system. So when the Fed buys $100 billion in securities, the securities go to the Fed, and then the previous owners of those securities get a check or multiple checks if they're multiple owners. What do those people do with the checks when they get them? What would you do if you got a check for $100 billion?
Deposit it?
Yeah, you put it in your bank. Now think about that. All of a sudden, your bank has $100 billion in new reserves. Okay. And the banking system has $100 billion because your bank is part of the banking system. What do banks do when they get a deposit? What do they do with the money?
So don't they put it, well, they don't put it somewhere, but they loan it out to other people.
Well, they take some of it and put it in the vault. Those are reserves, but then they loan the majority of it out to other people so that they can make money out of your money. Okay. So what happens is the money gets loaned out. That loan gets deposited in another bank. And then that bank takes out some and loans out the rest. And that gets deposited in another bank. So there's this whole deposit expansion process. And there's this thing called the money multiplier, which explains how much the money supply expands when the Fed does an open market purchase. Okay, so the bottom line is when the Fed buys $100 billion in securities, they're injecting $100 billion into the banking system. But when the dust settles, the money supply has increased by more than $100 billion. Now, there's a formula for this money multiplier thing. The simplest formula, the only one that we're going to use, is 1 over the required reserve ratio. So if the required reserve ratio is, say, 10%, then 1 over 10% is 10. What that means is when the Fed buys $100 billion in securities, the money supply increases by 10 times that amount. It increases by 100 times 10 is $1,000 billion. Okay, so the Fed is very powerful in terms of what it can accomplish. Now, let's tell the story in terms of a graph. I have a graph here. It's a little clunky looking because I drew it myself, but that's okay. Let me share my screen with you guys. Let me try to share my screen with you guys. And where is it? All right, can you see the graph there? Nod or give me a thumbs up or something. Okay, so the left-hand side graph is a picture of the money market. Okay, on the horizontal axis is money, supply and demand, and on the vertical axis is the interest rate. The interest rate is the price of borrowed money. Okay, this downward sloping line is demand for money. The demand for money is downward sloping, just like the demand for anything else is downward sloping. And instead of the price, we have the interest rate here. Okay, the Fed, because the Fed can set the money supply at any level that it wants to, the money supply curve is a vertical line at whatever level the Fed wants to set. So when the story starts before the open market purchase, we have a demand curve for money and we have a supply curve for money. And the equilibrium is right here. And that defines the current interest rate. Okay, let me jump over to the product market, which is graph B here. If we just take the initial story, here's aggregate expenditure, here's our 45-degree line. Product market equilibrium occurs right here. This is the equilibrium level of GDP. Okay, so just as this product market graph tells us what the equilibrium level of GDP is, the money market graph tells us what the equilibrium interest rate is. Does that make sense? All right, now, monetary policy. The Fed conducts an open market purchase. The money supply curve shifts to the right, which indicates more money in circulation, right? Money supply curve shifts to the right. At our original interest rate, here's the new money supply. Here's the money demand. Do we have a shortage or a surplus here in the money market? Rachel, what do you think? Money supply is out here, money demand is back there. Is that a shortage or a surplus?
So money demand is in the front and
money demand is on the money demand curve right here. So it's
okay.
right there.
And then
Money supply is out here.
So it's surplus.
Right. There's an excess supply of money. When there's an excess supply of anything, what happens to the price?
Doesn't it go down?
It does. And so this is no longer the equilibrium interest rate. Rather, we slide down the money demand curve to the new intersection between the new money supply and the current money demand curve. So we're at this interest rate and now we're at this interest rate. Does that make sense? It's just basic supply and demand.
Yeah.
Okay, now the exciting stuff starts. The story doesn't stop in the money market because we know that there are components of aggregate expenditure that are sensitive to the interest rate. When interest rates fall, what happens to car sales?
They go up.
They go up. It turns out that car sales are very sensitive to interest rates. So lower interest rates stimulate people's purchases of cars and other consumer durable goods that they buy on credit. What happens to real estate markets when interest rates go down?
They go up.
They go up, right? Same thing. Lower interest rates means mortgages are more affordable, and so you see a lot more home purchases and sales. And finally, business investment also goes up because it's cheaper for businesses to borrow the money to, say, build a bigger factory or buy some new equipment or something like that. So the result of this open market purchase is lower interest rates, and then the aggregate expenditure line shifts up. We were here in equilibrium, and suddenly that's not equilibrium anymore because the amount that customers are buying is up here. The amount that businesses are selling is down here. Okay? People are buying at a faster rate than businesses are producing. When that's the case, what happens to inventories that businesses are holding?
Inventories go down.
They have to go down because people are buying faster than businesses can replace that. So businesses see their inventories falling. How do they respond to that? That's a signal. What do they need to do?
Get more. But
They need
sometimes
to,
they increase their prices.
they can increase prices, but they also want to produce more of their products. And in order to produce more of their products, what do we need? What do they need to do? How does the business produce more? This is a Morgan question. They need to hire more people, right? Okay, so what happens is the economy, which was in equilibrium at this point and this level of GDP, is now in equilibrium at a higher level of GDP, where there's more GDP, possibly higher prices, and certainly more jobs, lower unemployment rate. This whole thing is called an expansionary monetary policy. The idea is to expand the economy, nudge the economy forward. Okay, so the chain of events, again, is the Fed buys Treasury securities. Okay, the money supply increases, interest rates fall, aggregate expenditure increases, and GDP rises as well with jobs. Okay, any questions about that? It's important that it's important that you know how to do these kinds of problems, because there will be something like this on the final. Okay, so it's a sequence of events. You have to figure out what causes what causes what. Okay, now there's only two possibilities here. The Fed can conduct an expansionary monetary policy to speed the economy up, or they can do a contractionary monetary policy to slow the economy down. It's completely symmetric. It's explained on this page. And there's even a graph. I'll leave that up to you to read and figure out on your own. Okay, any questions about monetary policy? That's how monetary policy works. You awake, Rachel? Okay, good. Okay, that's really all I wanted to do tonight. I do want to point out that we're not going to meet next week because I'm going to be on the road on my way to Thanksgiving, and I suspect some of you guys will be also, except not Morgan because she doesn't have that far to go. All right, well, then I will let you guys go. Thanks for meeting.
Have a nice night.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.